The fire pit cracked and hissed in the middle of the backyard, sending thin ribbons of black smoke curling into the evening air. The smell of burning plastic rose fast, mixing with grilled meat and the sweet trace of spilled wine. I sensed something wrong before the laughter started. The silver box I had wrapped myself, the one my daughter had waited half a year for, was being swallowed by the flames. The red ribbon curled in on itself, the foil wrinkled, melting into the shape of hurt. Ethan, my 16-year-old nephew, stood closest to the pit. He laughed first, loud and sharp, proud of himself. The others joined in their voices, tumbling over one another. A few adults lifted their glasses, pretending this was still a party, still harmless. Then I heard Caroline, my sister, her voice bright, practiced. "Oh, come on, it's just a joke." It wasn't. Everyone knew it wasn't. But her words hung there like a curtain people were relieved to hide behind. Sophie didn't move. Her arms hung by her sides, eyes fixed on the fire, as if trying to hold what was left. Her mouth trembled once, then stilled. She didn't cry. Her face had gone pale, but her silence was louder than any scream could have been. I started walking toward the fire pit. The laughter faded like sound underwater. The plastic hissed and sagged, the metal bent. The smell of it sank into my clothes. I grabbed a damp towel from the buffet table and threw it into the flames. The fire hissed back, then folded in on itself. A thin trail of smoke rose, twisting in the wind. I turned to Ethan. He was still smiling, but not with his eyes anymore. I didn't raise my voice. "You think that's funny?" He didn't answer. No one did. Caroline gave a little shrug. "Kids, Grant. They didn't mean it." I looked around. Faces I had known all my life and didn't recognize anymore. Peter's co-workers, Caroline's friends, neighbors who showed up for food and photos. All of them quiet, pretending the air wasn't full of what it was full of. I took Sophie's coat, placed it gently on her shoulders, felt her small body shaking under the fabric. "Keep your kids away from mine." I said it softly, not angry, not loud. Just enough to end something that had been breaking for years. We left. The wind caught the string lights behind us, made them clink together like fragile glass. The laughter started again, thin, nervous, like it was trying to fill the space we left behind. The road out of Caroline's neighborhood was empty. Streetlights in Boulder threw pale gold lines across the damp pavement. My hands were tight on the wheel. Sophie sat beside me, staring out the window. She didn't cry, didn't speak. Her breathing came small and even, and for the first time I realized how quiet a child could be when the world taught her to be. By the time we reached Aurora, the city had gone to sleep. I parked in front of our building and turned off the engine. The porch light fell across Sophie's face. Her eyes were rimmed red, but dry. I opened the door, letting in the cold air. "Go inside, honey." The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old pine wood. I turned on the kitchen light. It spread over the table where I'd spent so many nights counting bills, planning what could never quite stretch far enough. Sophie sat at the table, shoulders drawn in. I warmed a glass of milk, set it in front of her. "Drink up. Tomorrow's a new start." She nodded, silent, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The skin on her fingers was rough from art pencils, the little scars I hadn't noticed before. I saw myself in those hands, the same small stubbornness that keeps a person from falling apart. After she went to her room, the door closed without a sound. I stayed at the table. The kitchen light glowed softly across the empty surface. My phone buzzed. Caroline's name. "Don't make a big deal out of it." The kids were just playing. I stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it. The old expense ledger sat in the drawer where I kept it. I opened it, tracing the neat blue handwriting across the page. Family Assistance Fund, birthday catering, $480. I read it twice. The air left the room. My hands went cold. I closed the book and sat still. The glass of milk was cooling on the table, a thin skin forming on top. I thought of every year I had told myself patience was strength, that Caroline would see what I saw, that family was something that could be repaired if you just kept your voice down long enough. I walked to Sophie's desk. Her chair had tipped over. I set it right. On the desk was a drawing she hadn't finished, colors soft, almost afraid to fill the page. I picked up a pencil that had rolled to the floor, placed it back where it belonged. Outside, the wind changed direction. I could still smell faint smoke in the air. The clock ticked, each second like a thin cut through thought. I closed the door behind me. The apartment went quiet, truly quiet. I could hear my own breathing, steady and real, and beneath it, still burning somewhere in memory, the crackle of fire, the sound of laughter, and the silence that followed. I didn't sleep that night. My mind went back to another winter, to a hospital room so white it seemed to hum. Laura lay there still, as if she were only resting after a long trip. The doctor had said we did everything we could. Her heart had let go. Sophie was 8, then her wide eyes fixed on the heart monitor, as though if it kept blinking, her mother might stay. I bent down and told her we were going home, that everything would be all right, the kind of lie adults tell when they've run out of anything else to give. The funeral took place under a Colorado sky so clear it almost felt cruel. Caroline arrived early, hugged Sophie longer than usual, then turned to me and said without her, "You wouldn't make it through this." For a while after that, she came by often. She made soup, folded laundry, picked up Sophie from school when I was buried in paperwork. She did what needed doing, but every act of kindness came with something invisible attached, like a faint ink mark you couldn't scrub away. My father, Arthur, a railman, his whole life rested a heavy hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "Hen, don't get to be weak." My mother, Helen, came with a basket of muffins and a handful of tissues. She cried, then turned to Caroline and said she'd always been the responsible one. She told me, "You're good with your hands." But where will that take you? I said nothing. Silence had always been the safer choice in my family. Words only made the cracks wider. A month later, I left the old house and moved to a small 2-bedroom in Aurora. I switched to night shifts at Denver International so I could spend the days with Sophie, help with homework, pack lunches, sit through parent-teacher meetings. I learned the sound of the airport's power grid, the way some men learn the ocean. Each hum, each click, a language of its own. It was honest work. When something broke, you fixed it. There was comfort in that. Most mornings I came home just before dawn. The air smelled faintly of frost. I toasted bread, packed Sophie's lunch, checked the crumpled notes she brought from school. She had started drawing more bright houses, winding roads, suns with too many rays. I taped her sketches on the refrigerator door like small charms against whatever might come. Caroline still visited. She left behind advice like receipts on a counter. "You should enroll Sophie in dance. You should ask Peter about your car loan. You can't work nights forever, Grant. Where will that lead?" Sophie learned to smile politely when her aunt spoke, then disappear into her room and close the door. I'd stand in the hallway, hand on the knob, and tell myself she'd find her own way through it. In early 2019, Mom called about Dad's prescriptions. I said I'd handle my share. I opened a separate account and named it the Family Assistance Fund, a quiet reminder that help has limits, that it's a fund, not a river. Each month I put in what I could from my night shifts. It paid for medicine repairs, a bit of peace. Then Caroline said her credit card bill was overdue. I added her to the list. It felt temporary, Everything always does at first. The year 2020 moved slowly. Caroline's texts came and went, brief thank yous, casual reminders. You're lucky to have a sister like me. I deleted most of them after reading. I didn't need another layer of dust on my heart. By 2021, life had found a rhythm again. Sophie had grown taller than the kitchen counter, her voice deeper, her laughter steadier. She joined the art club, came home smelling of ink and paper. Dad forgot things more often. Mom repeated herself. Caroline threw herself into PTA meetings in Boulder. We had dinner together a few times a month, mostly at Caroline's, where every plate matched and the wine never ran out. That night, Peter talked about the bank, about big clients and year-end bonuses. Caroline cut a slice of meatloaf and set it gently on my plate as though generosity could erase distance. She asked about my night shifts, about the wires, about the risks. I told her it was safe enough we followed procedures. Sophie handed her a hand-drawn card. She'd made a small watercolor of their house. Caroline smiled, said it was lovely, and slid it quietly into a drawer. Dinner went on with the sound of silverware tapping plates. Then, in a lull, Caroline looked at me. My brother's a good man, she said. Poor but kind. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then conversation resumed as if the moment hadn't happened. Peter chuckled, confirming what everyone already believed. Mom cleared her throat and nodded proud. Dad set down his fork, eyes fixed on the table. Beside me, Sophie's hands stilled. She looked up at me, searching my face for something steady. I smiled, a small, practiced smile to tell her I was still here. Still enough for both of us. On the drive back to Aurora, Sophie fell asleep holding her sketchbook. The roads were slick, the street lights stretching into long, tired ribbons. I kept thinking about the phrase poor but kind, about the account I'd opened, about every payment that left my hands. Each dollar was a thread, and I had tied them all around myself without realizing how tight they'd become. At home, the heater hummed softly. I opened my ledger and traced the lines of what I'd sent parents, sister, everything that had once felt right. The numbers didn't move, but they held like knots. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving a thin strip of hallway glow. I checked on Sophie. Her hand caught mine for a moment, then drifted away in sleep. Back in the kitchen, the open page waited blank as a door not yet chosen. Somewhere far off, a low rumble, maybe a plane touching down in Denver. Someone was home. I stood there in the dim light and realized I was still trying to find my way back. For the next 6 months, I worked as if I owed a debt to my own breathing. Every night at Denver International, the wind slipped through the metal ducts, the hum of the generators steady as a heartbeat. Each week I tucked $50 into a small brown envelope and slid it into the back of the kitchen cabinet beside the salt jar. I stopped eating out, stopped buying coffee from the corner shop, changed the oil on my old Ford with hands that smelled of gasoline. Spring moved in a straight line. I grew used to ending my shifts just as dawn broke, watching the first light spread across the empty parking lot. Sophie was in 8th grade, then changing a little every day. She asked me what the sky looked like from the airport, where the planes went at midnight. Each one has its own direction, I told her. No two are the same. She nodded, said that sounded a lot like people. In July, I counted the envelopes, $3,200. Enough to believe that a quiet promise could become real. I didn't tell anyone. Once, while Sophie was sketching at the dining table, I asked what she wanted for her birthday. She shrugged and smiled. I don't need anything, Dad. The school computers still work. Her answer made my goal sharper, not smaller. I wrote a short line in my ledger, neat as a vow. Laptop for Sophie, September. Late summer, I picked up an extra maintenance shift that stretched past dawn. Nobody wanted it. Too many fumes, too little sleep. I took it without hesitation. I learned to eat a sandwich in 3 minutes, to nap standing up between inspections. Some nights I came home too tired to take off my shoes. I'd wake on the floor, remember her face, and stand again. Coffee. Work. Repeat. By early September 2023, the total was right. I left home early with the envelope in my pocket and drove down Arapahoe Avenue to the Denver Tech Store. Morning sunlight hit the glass front, scattering gold across the lot. The clerk, a young guy with the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, asked what I was looking for. Something sturdy, I said. Something for a girl who wants to design things. He led me to a display of new models reciting specs and warranties and weekend discounts. When I handed him the envelope, he blinked. "Would you like to add the extended warranty?" That made me smile. "No," I said. "I just need it to reach my daughter tonight." He nodded, printed the receipt, packed the computer into a silver box that gleamed in the light. At home, I wrapped the box myself in plain white paper and taped a small label across the top, "Happy Birthday, Kiddo." The handwriting made me think of Laura, her tilted letters always ending with a soft sadness. That afternoon, I came home early and placed the box on the kitchen table. Sophie returned from school, hair messy, backpack dragging. She looked at the box, half curious, half suspicious. I told her birthdays don't always have to wait for the right day. She unwrapped it slowly, layer by layer. When the lid came off and the screen caught the light, it flashed across her face like sunrise. She looked up at me, silent for a few seconds, then threw her arms around me so tightly I had to catch my balance. Her voice was small, but every word clear. "I'll make you proud, Dad." I didn't answer. I just placed my hand on her head and listened to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady, certain enough. In that moment, every sleepless night had meaning. Every dollar had a shape. And that shape was her smile. After dinner, Sophie set up the laptop, downloaded her design software, and started learning. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the blue light from the screen paint her face with quiet joy. Outside, the air smelled of the coming fall. The wind moved through the trees like it had somewhere to be. I made a cup of coffee, sat down, and listened to the soft rhythm of typing mixed with the low hum of the heater. At 10 o'clock, she carried the laptop to her room and said goodnight. I stayed where I was, letting the silence settle. The apartment glowed in one small corner, and on the table the empty silver box caught the light. The city grew quieter as the night deepened. I stepped onto the balcony. The air was sharp with the smell of metal and rain. Far away, the runway lights at Denver blinked in their endless pattern. I thought about the remaining envelopes in the cupboard, about the months still waiting ahead, and about what I had already taught her without saying a word. What we earn with our own hands never loses its worth. Before going to bed, I looked into her room. The new laptop cast a faint glow over the desk. Sophie had fallen asleep there, her head resting on her arm, the screen still open on an unfinished sketch. I pulled a blanket over her shoulders and glanced at the drawing. A small house, a window open to the light, 2 coffee cups on the table, steam rising between them. I smiled, soft as breath, and turned off the light. That image stayed with me for a long time, a small brightness lodged inside a gray stretch of days. I didn't know then that weeks later, that same light would become the brightest and the most painful thing left in my memory. The sky over Boulder that day was clear and cold. I drove slowly through streets soaked in yellow light, the silver box resting safely on the back seat. Sophie sat beside me, holding a small bouquet for her Aunt Caroline, her face a mix of excitement and unease. In the rearview mirror, I caught the reflection of the box, a small patch of light I wanted to keep forever. By the time we arrived, Carolyn's backyard was already full. The guests were her friends and Peter's co-workers, people who spoke with cheerful voices that never reached their eyes. They laughed, clinked glasses, asked me polite questions about the airport questions meant to fill the air, not to hear the answers. Peter came over, clapped me on the shoulder, his tone half teasing. "Looks like all that overtime finally paid off, huh?" "Grant." I smiled and said nothing. Sophie held the gift box close and walked toward the table where the kids were gathered around the fire pit. Ethan, Caroline's son, 2 years older than Sophie, blonde, always carrying that need to prove something, was circling nearby. He glanced at the box, smirked. "Cheap laptop, huh?" "Uncle," I turned my voice low but firm. "That's enough, Ethan." He shrugged, grinning wider. Caroline saw it and came over, still holding her wine glass. "Oh, come on," she said lightly. "Kids will be kids." I looked straight at her. Not everything should be excused by those words. The party went on. The smell of grilled meat hung thick in the air. Adults talked about housing prices, upcoming vacations. I sat at the far table watching Sophie laugh with a few classmates, her face glowing under the string lights. For a moment, I let myself believe the night would pass quietly. Then I heard Ethan's voice. He called out to someone, and the group of kids burst into laughter. One of them held up Sophie's box, waving it over his head. Ethan snatched it, shook it once, said something that made the others roar louder. I stood up and started walking toward them. "Give it back, Ethan." He stepped back, still smiling. "You scared Uncle just playing around." Caroline called out from across the yard, her voice half amused, half annoyed. "Ethan, don't be stupid." But before anyone could move, he turned and tossed the box straight into the fire pit. The lid hit the stones with a hollow sound. Flames leapt up, bright gold, too real. The guests laughed again, thinking it was some party trick, some kind of confetti burning. I stared at the fire, swallowing the silver paper, the smoke turning white, then black. Sophie stood frozen, her face drained of color. No one seemed to notice until the smell hit the sharp chemical scent of melting plastic. A few people grimaced but still tried to smile. Ethan backed away, his grin fading, as if he couldn't quite understand what he'd done. I reached for a nearby bottle of water and poured it straight into the pit. The fire hissed smoke curling up into the cold air, the light dimming to gray. No one spoke. The music kept playing, but it belonged to another world now. I looked around. Every face turned away, searching for safety and pretending. Peter, closest to me, forced a chuckle. He didn't mean to grant. "Just a joke." I looked straight at him. "That was my daughter's computer." Caroline approached, setting her glass down, her smile thin and shaky. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it was just kids being silly." The chill that went through me wasn't from the wind, it came from the silence that followed her words. I turned to Sophie. She was trembling, her lips parted, but soundless, her eyes fixed on the rising smoke. I knelt, put a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart. Let's go home." I stood, draped my jacket over her shoulders. The yard had gone still. The fire cracked softly, each pop echoing in the quiet. I looked around the table, my voice calm, too calm. "Does no one see anything wrong here?" No one answered. My mother stood in the back, her eyes cast down. Peter poured himself more wine. Caroline's face was caught between shame and defiance. I spoke slowly, each word a clean break. "Keep your kids away from mine." I took Sophie's hand and led her out. The wooden gate closed behind us with a dry, hollow sound. The wind moved through the hanging lights, making them clink faintly, like something fragile breaking far away. On the drive home, the streets were nearly empty. The streetlights stretched out in long, tired bands of yellow. Sophie sat silent, staring out the window. The reflections of the lamps flickered across her face, small broken pieces of light that refused to stay still. When we pulled up to the apartment, I turned off the engine and sat for a moment. Outside, the branches scraped lightly against the car. Sophie opened her door, walked inside first. I followed, locking the door, hanging my coat. She sat at the kitchen table, head bowed. I took a damp cloth and wiped her hands gently. Her eyes were red but dry. I spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "Go to bed, honey. Tomorrow we start again." She nodded and went to her room. I stayed there, staring out the window at the city lights, bright and indifferent. In my head, only the sound of the fire remained, the laughter, the silence that swallowed it, the strange rhythm of everything breaking at once. I sat there long after midnight. No lights, no movement, just the ticking of the clock. 1 minute, then another. Time went on, but something in me had stopped. And I knew from that moment on our lives would never be the same again. The kitchen was so quiet, I could hear the snow tapping against the window. I opened the drawer and took out the old expense envelope, the one that had become a kind of ritual proof that a life could still be kept in order even when everything else was slipping apart. The paper inside was creased at the corners, the handwriting neat and deliberate, as if each number could hold chaos at bay. I ran a finger down the list until it stopped on the newest entry. Family Assistance Fund. Catering party, $480. I read it once, then again. Each word sank deeper, heavier, until I felt my hand start to tremble. I just sat there staring at the number, feeling as though someone had quietly drained the blood from my body without a knife. $480. The same amount I set aside every month for my parents' medicine, for Caroline's credit card emergency, for the needs that were supposed to be good and necessary. Only now I knew what that money had really bought: food, wine balloons, tables, and the fire that swallowed my daughter's only birthday gift. The phone buzzed on the table, its screen glowing dimly in the dark. I didn't reach for it right away. I just watched the light reflecting on the surface of the table like a thin blade. Then the message appeared. "Don't make a big deal out of it. The kids were just playing." I read it slowly, word by word, letting the weight of each syllable settle. No apology. No awareness of what had been broken. Just carelessness wrapped in the soft tone of entitlement. I put the phone down, deleted the message. No reply necessary. I folded the paper back into the envelope and set it beside Sophie's glass of milk. The surface was still warm white and quiet, trembling only slightly as the wind slipped through the cracks in the window. I stared at it for a long time. Warmth doesn't vanish all at once, it fades quietly until it becomes something else. That's how trust dies. No explosion, no smoke, no scene. Just a slow cooling until what once lived turns still and will never return. I thought of Caroline. I wondered if she even knew there was a line she had crossed, or if lines meant anything to her anymore. Maybe she didn't have to think about it. In her world, she was always standing above it all, measured against people like me. To her, I was never really a man. I was a mirror that made her feel taller. And Sophie, my daughter, was just another reflection she could claim without understanding. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. The flakes hit the glass and melted, streaking down like words being erased. I watched them for a while, feeling something inside me start to dissolve too. Things were suddenly clear in a way that hurt. The heater clicked on with a low hum, steady as a sleeping breath. I closed the ledger and slid it back into the drawer. The feeling of the paper lingered in my hand, the texture, the number, the cold that had found its way through my skin. Some things once touched never leave you. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The image came back, Sophie holding the silver box, smiling. Then the fire in bolder flames climbing into the night. Both moments overlapped, fusing into one single light, bright and unbearable. I didn't know which I hated more, the hand that threw it, or the laughter that followed. Maybe deep down I hated myself most of all for believing for so long that goodness would be enough. The wind rose outside, rattling the hallway light. I stood and walked to the window, shutting it tight. The ledger lay motionless on the table. I knew I would never open it the same way again. It was no longer a record of expenses. It was an archive of losses, each line written by someone else's hand, but signed with my silence. From Sophie's room came a faint stripe of light beneath the door. She was asleep, I hoped. Maybe dreaming of that night of the fire turning gentle, of everyone finally quiet. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the hallway glow. My shadow stretched long across the wall, broken and uneven. In that dimness, I heard the clock strike midnight, each tick deliberate, cold, patient. I took a slow breath, held it, then let it go as if releasing the part of me that had stayed quiet for too long. When I entered my room, the yard outside was blanketed white. The streetlight cut through the frost, scattering its light like pieces of glass. The world looked peaceful, untouched, as if it had never known what had burned hours before. I closed the curtains, leaving a thin crack open. Sat on the edge of the bed. My hand still carried the faint scent of warm milk. A breath slipped out in silence. And in that moment, I understood. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's a vow. A beginning. The next morning, snow still blanketed the steps, thick and untouched. I stepped outside, pulling my old coat tight around my neck. Each breath turned to pale smoke in the frozen air. The sun had not fully risen yet. Its faint light slid across the neighboring roofs, making everything look both close and impossibly distant. I didn't tell Sophie where I was going. She was still asleep, her small hand clutching the worn bear she'd had since she was little, her face peaceful in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. The road to Boulder was quiet. The tires pressed through the snow with a soft, tearing sound, like paper being slowly ripped apart. I turned on the radio for company, then switched it off after a few seconds. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was just the space I needed to do what had to be done. At Boulder Credit Union, the glass doors were fogged from the warmth inside. The wooden floors gleamed, the teller counters were spotless, and the air smelled faintly of fresh coffee. A young woman behind the counter greeted me with a polite, cautious smile, her voice soft enough not to disturb the morning calm. I said I wanted to close the Family Assistance Fund account. She looked up, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Are you sure, sir, that account still pays for your parents' medication and your sister's debts?" I nodded steady. "That's why I'm here." She hesitated a moment, then began typing. The sound of the keys was sharp and rhythmic, echoing faintly in the quiet room. Lines of numbers appeared on her screen, each transaction a small record of the months and years I had sent money without fail. At the bottom of the list, the last few payments glowed. I saw the one for $480. My chest tightened, but my hand didn't move. "Would you like to cancel the autopay as well?" she asked. "Yes," and removed the secondary card. She printed the form and slid a pen toward me. The paper was thin, smooth, cold, the texture of something final. I signed my name slowly, not shaking, but feeling something drain out through my hand as the ink met the page. She tore off the confirmation slip and placed it in front of me. Would you like a digital copy sent to your email? No. The paper is enough. I folded it in half and held it for a moment. It felt like cutting through a thin cord I'd tied around my own neck for years. Every month I'd told myself I was doing the right thing, that kindness could fix what had gone crooked. But kindness, I'd learned, can also be a kind of cage, one you build for yourself, while others grow comfortable watching you live inside it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I stepped outside under the awning to answer. My mother's voice came through thin and trembling. "What are you doing?" "Grant," Caroline said. "You shut down the fund. She's struggling." I closed my eyes, listening to the wind hum through the power lines above me. "I've struggled too, Mom." No one asked then. Silence. A sigh. Then the click of disconnection. I stood still, watching people begin to fill the street. They carried coffee cups, talked about the weather, about the holidays coming up. The world moved as if nothing had happened, because to it, nothing had. No one knew that a man had just signed away the piece of himself that once made him believe he was good. But I knew, and that was enough. Back in the car, I sat for a long moment before starting the engine. The confirmation slip lay on the passenger seat, its edge catching the cold light. I looked at it the way someone looks at a map that finally shows a way out. The engine turned over with a rough, low sound. In the rearview mirror, the small bank building grew smaller, then disappeared behind a curve of road. Snow kept falling light and steady, as if the sky too was letting go of something it no longer needed to carry. On the way back, I stopped at a small cafe near the high school. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of waffles and faint jazz. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window. The steam rose gently, fogging the glass circling the rim of the cup, like breath you could see. I unfolded the paper and smoothed it flat on the table. Account terminated. The words were printed in bold, clean ink, cold, but strangely beautiful in their honesty. An older man at the next table glanced over, smiled, and asked softly if I'd just closed an account. "Something like that," I said. He nodded, his voice low and knowing. "Sometimes you have to close one thing so that something else can open." I didn't answer. I just looked out the window at the falling snow, each flake landing on the parked cars and melting without sound. I thought of Sophie, of her face in the firelight, of the silent promise I had made to her and to myself. Maybe every real change begins with a single, small act the first time you choose yourself without apology. I finished the coffee. The bitterness lingered in my throat, grounding me. When I stepped back outside, the weak sun had risen. The snow was melting into gray puddles along the curb, little rivers carrying away what was old. I slipped the confirmation paper into my coat pocket and felt the edge graze my palm, a faint, almost weightless sensation, like someone had just untied a rope from around my neck. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. Driving back toward Aurora, I rolled the window down. The cold air swept in, carrying the scent of pine and snowmelt. I left it open, hand resting on the wheel, eyes steady on the road ahead. The road stretched long and clear before me, and I knew then my boundaries were finally holding. 2 days later, as I was pouring my morning coffee, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. I didn't think much of it until I saw the name on the screen, Henry Tran, a former neighbor. He had sent a single link and 3 words, "You should watch." I tapped the screen. The video opened slowly, the image shaking slightly, as if filmed by unsteady hands. I recognized the backyard instantly, Caroline's. The low string lights, the scattered dishes, the wind mixed with laughter. In the center of the frame stood Ethan holding the silver box. Someone off camera laughed a loud, bright laugh that split the air, and then the fire rose. The box dropped into the pit. Metal warped. Plastic melted. The flames burned high. And through it all, I heard Carolyn's voice, her laughter clear, familiar, so close I almost turned around. The person filming didn't speak. They just held the camera steady, letting the moment exist. When the clip ended, a sentence appeared across the screen, simple, quiet, and devastating. Sometimes silence hurts more than fire. I watched until the screen went black, my hand still frozen around the phone. A small part of me wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it was edited, twisted, someone's cruel idea of a joke. But it wasn't. The light, the voices, the sound of the flames, they were exactly as I remembered. I had been there. I scrolled down to the comments. Each one was like a blade, clean, cold, merciless. This isn't a joke. Those kids need to learn respect. The adults in this video should be ashamed. And then one line stopped me. If I were that girl's father, I'd never forget this. It felt like someone had spoken the thought I hadn't been able to form. The name of the uploader sat clearly at the top, Henry Tran, Caroline's neighbor, the man who lived behind her white fence, who used to wave at me on Sunday mornings. I didn't think he meant to expose anyone. Maybe he'd just recorded it without knowing what he was capturing. But sometimes accident looks a lot like justice. 10 minutes later, the video was gone. The page read, "Content not available." Caroline was already trying to erase it. I searched YouTube. It was there again. A smaller channel had re-uploaded it. Then someone shared it on Twitter. Then Reddit. The clip spread like a spark on dry grass. Quick, quiet, unstoppable. I opened my laptop and began an email to Sophie's school counselor, Olivia Grant. Just 3 lines, for awareness only. Please review. I pasted the link and hit send. No explanations, no requests. Sometimes the truth doesn't need defending. It only needs a place to land. That afternoon, Sophie sat in the living room, her backpack open but untouched. I brought her a cup of warm milk, set it down. She didn't touch it. After a long silence, her voice came out small and rough, too old for her age. "Dad, I'm scared to go to school." I sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at me, eyes red, searching for something, safety maybe, or faith, something. I wasn't sure I still knew how to give. "You're not going alone," I said. "Whatever happens, I'm walking with you." She nodded, tears slipping quietly down onto the wooden table, leaving small, perfect circles. I knew in that moment something in her world had been taken, a kind of trust no adult has the right to break. That night, an email came from Olivia. Short, precise, heavy with meaning. "Thank you for sharing this. We will handle the matter seriously. Sophie will be protected." I read it again and again, not to believe it, but to remember what it felt like when someone else finally saw what I saw. After Sophie fell asleep, I watched the video again. Nothing had changed, same sound, same fire, same laughter. But this time I saw it differently. I noticed every face behind the flames, the half smiles, the quick glances, the small, satisfied looks. They thought it was a joke, a harmless lesson. They didn't realize that indifference can leave scars deeper than cruelty, and that what they'd done had already been recorded forever. I saved the video, named the file by the date it happened, made a backup, then another. Outside, the wind was sharp and dry. I stepped onto the balcony. The air smelled faintly of smoke, carried from somewhere down the block, a ghost of fire that refused to fade. Under the streetlight, the snow was melting into streaks of gray, mixed with mud and footprints. I thought of Carolyn somewhere, probably on the phone, deleting accounts, sending excuses that sounded like apologies. But the internet has no exit doors. Once truth surfaces, it doesn't drown. It spreads. Inside, I heard Sophie turn in her sleep. I went to her room. She was restless, clutching her blanket, her brow creased. The hallway light fell softly across her face, peaceful, fragile. I sat beside her bed and whispered quietly enough for only myself to hear. "No one will make you afraid again." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, phone lighting up again and again, with messages, coworkers, old friends, strangers. I didn't reply. I just watched the glow flicker on the wall, little bursts of light like tiny flames. But this time, they didn't burn. They illuminated. By dawn, I poured another cup of coffee. The first sunlight stretched across the table, turning the thin layer of dust into something that shimmered like smoke before it fades. The phone still buzzed, still hummed with the noise of the world. But I didn't feel the weight anymore. Outside, the last patches of snow were melting. The street was quiet. Houses along the block still glowed with warm, waking light. I turned back toward Sophie's room. She was still asleep, hair tangled, breathing slow and steady. When she woke, the world would still be talking, still pointing, still loud. But this time they wouldn't be laughing. And when she stepped out the door, I'd be beside her. Because justice doesn't always need to win. It just needs to be seen. A week later, I sat in the small conference room at Aurora Middle School. The lights were bright, the wooden table long, the chairs arranged in a circle. On the wall hung an old poster that read, "Together we grow." The air smelled of coffee and freshly printed paper, an odd mix of formality and fatigue. Sophie sat beside me, her hands gripping the edge of her jacket, eyes fixed on the table. Across the room, Olivia Grant stood with a folder in her hand. Her voice steady, clear, neither cold nor soft. The meeting began with the principal, a kind man in his 50s, careful with every word. He spoke about the school's duty to protect its students, about the community's role in setting examples for them to follow. Heads nodded around the table. Some parents took notes. Others simply sat still. I listened quietly, waiting. I knew at some point all eyes would turn toward me. When it was Olivia's turn, she opened her laptop and connected it to the large screen. There was no video, just still frames frozen at the clearest moments. Ethan holding the silver box, the fire rising. And behind him, Caroline's face caught mid-smile. Olivia spoke plainly, each sentence deliberate. A student of this school was publicly humiliated during a family gathering. The act has been verified by multiple parents, supported by independent photographic evidence. There is no distortion, no accusation, only what occurred. The room grew heavy. No one spoke. A parent beside me let out a slow sigh. The wind outside brushed against the small window, its faint sound like the room itself exhaling. Caroline sat 2 seats away, her shoulders rigid. She forced a laugh, her voice trembling at the edges. "Oh, come on. It was just a silly prank. The kids didn't mean any harm." Olivia met her eyes. Her tone stayed calm but left no room to escape. With all respect, this wasn't a prank. It was bullying. And it caused real harm. No one laughed. The principal nodded slowly, his expression grave. "The school has received confirmation from several parents who witnessed the event," he said. "We'll be enforcing the disciplinary actions accordingly. Ethan suspended for 10 days. Ava formally reprimanded." Caroline turned sharply toward me. Her eyes were red, her voice rough and quick, trembling with anger. "You did this, didn't you? You sent the video. You tried to destroy my children." I didn't answer right away. The whole room waited. Then I looked up, my tone low even. "No. I didn't have to do anything." The truth found its own way here. The words hung in the air, then faded. The silence that followed was deep enough to feel. Even the wall clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. Caroline looked around, searching for someone to back her, but no one did. Her shoulders sagged. Her hand rested on the table, trembling slightly, though she tried to hold steady. For the first time, I didn't feel angry. Just empty. Empty in the way something sounds after the echo has died, the space where noise used to live. The principal wrote down the final notes his voice measured. Ethan's suspension will last 10 school days. He'll attend a restorative counseling session before returning. Ava will participate in a community course on empathy and respect. The family will be required to sign a behavioral commitment form. Sophie sat silently beside me. Then I heard her exhale a small, trembling breath as if she'd been holding it for days. I placed my hand on her shoulder. The tension in her frame eased little by little. When the meeting ended, chairs shuffled, papers folded, people stood to leave. Caroline stayed seated, eyes on the table. I glanced her way. The overhead lights caught the dark circles under her eyes. The defiance that once filled her gaze was gone, replaced by something quieter. Fatigue, maybe even shame. I gathered my papers, thanked Olivia and the principal, and walked out. Outside, the air was cold but clean. Noon sunlight spilled across the school courtyard, flashing off the wet leaves and puddles of melted frost. Sophie walked beside me, silent, her steps slower, lighter. At the parking lot, she stopped and looked up at me. The wind pushed her hair back from her face. Her eyes held something fragile between relief and doubt. "Dad, do you think they hate us now?" "Maybe some will," I said. "But that doesn't matter. What matters is you didn't stay silent." She nodded, a faint smile appearing the first in days. I opened the car door for her and looked back at the building one more time. The sign above the entrance read, "Aurora Middle School," glinting under the sunlight. I thought about how justice doesn't always arrive with a gavel or an apology. Sometimes it comes in the quiet moment, when people can no longer laugh at what's wrong. We drove away. The road sloped gently downhill, lined with tall winter trees, casting long shadows on the pavement. My hands were steady on the wheel. Behind me, Sophie leaned against the window, eyes closed, finally, breathing evenly. In the rearview mirror, I caught the golden light spreading across the schoolyard where other children were still playing. The world, as always, kept moving. But for me and for my daughter, something had ended, and maybe in the silence that followed, something new had just begun to grow. November came with the first snowstorm of the season, stronger than the forecasts had promised. Warnings filled the radio since dawn, high winds, heavy ice on the runway's visibility near zero. I reached Denver International before sunrise. The floodlights threw long ribbons of gold across the snow, glittering like the breath of a city trying to stay alive. When the gate opened, the wind rushed through the gap and bit straight through my coat. Mark Riley was waiting inside the operations wing. His face looked tight, but his eyes were clear and awake. The power grid for the northern navigation sector had gone down overnight. Half the system was dark, and the morning flights were minutes away from cancellation. My crew of 5 had been called in early. We moved through the storm together, heads bent low, safety vests glowing in the dark. Every breath turned to vapor and broke apart in front of us. Inside the control substation, the air was metallic, cold enough to sting the throat. The panels blinked red, the kind of red that doesn't ask it commands. I pulled off my gloves, crouched, and began tracing cables, checking fuses one by one. Outside, the wind hit the walls with the rhythm of waves. The clock on the far wall read 2:00 a.m. Every minute that passed meant another plane grounded another crew, stranded another traveler waiting to go home. I didn't think about any of that consciously, but some part of me worked for them anyway. By 4, the backup feed began flickering too. I slid under the console, my hands greasy with oil and frost. A main line had frozen solid inside its conduit. I flicked my lighter, letting the flame travel along the pipe until a thread of smoke rose and the metal hissed. When the warning light shifted from red to amber, everyone froze. For a second, there was only the hum of current returning, and then someone whispered, "It's alive." Mark clapped a hand on my shoulder and laughed a hoarse, grateful sound, swallowed by the machines spinning back to life. Through the glass, the runway lights began to bloom one by one, stretching out into the snow like veins, filling with blood again. The pilots at the radio post cheered, some raised their hands toward the window. I didn't join in. I just stood there watching the light crawl outward, thinking of the people who would land safely because of a circuit I'd touched with my own hands. The storm reached its peak just before dawn. Each thunderclap made the floor tremble slightly, but the system held. I ran a final test, logged the data, and closed the maintenance ledger. The clock ticked past 6. Outside, snow blanketed everything in white silence, but the lights stayed bright, steady, unwavering. Mark returned with 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising between us like a truce. "You're the reason the lights stayed on," he said quietly. I smiled, not answering. He pulled an envelope from his coat and pressed it into my hand. "Go home, Grant. You've earned it." Inside was a printed bonus slip, $2,500 for emergency duty. A number clear and sharp, but somehow it felt lighter than it looked. I tucked it into my inner pocket and stepped out into the storm. Snow pressed against my face, the wind a constant push at my back. The parking lot was buried. My car looked like a sculpture made of ice. I scraped the windshield, sat down inside, and started the heater. The fan roared softly, melting the frost in delicate trails across the glass. The drive to Aurora was slow. The highway shimmered in shades of gray. The wind shoved at the car, but I kept going calm. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel heavy. There was a quiet peace inside me, a tiredness that didn't hurt. I thought about Sophie, about the fear in her voice when she said she didn't want to go to school, about the silver box, about the flames, about all the nights I'd chosen silence, because I didn't know what else to do. And then I thought of the runway lights, how after hours in the dark, they'd come back on one by one, steady, patient. Maybe fairness is like that, I thought. It doesn't arrive all at once. It just needs someone willing to thaw the wire that's been frozen too long. When I got home, I didn't turn on the main light. I opened my old laptop, logged into the site where I'd bought Sophie's first one. I found the same model, the same silver casing, same screen size, same keyboard she'd loved tapping late into the night. The listing read, "Estimated delivery 2 days." I clicked express shipping, typed in our address, hit confirm. The screen flashed, "Thank you for your order." I watched those words glow in the dark room, soft as a hand on my shoulder. It felt like the world whispering that somehow things might be all right again. Outside, the snow kept falling slow, deliberate, beautiful. I pulled back the curtain. Under the streetlight, flakes drifted sideways, bright and soundless, like tiny pieces of silence finding a place to land. Upstairs, Sophie stirred. The bed springs creaked softly. Tomorrow she'd wake, pack her things, and walk back into the world. She'd smile again. I was sure of it. I poured myself a glass of water and set the envelope on the table. White paper, blue ink, the number neat and certain. I didn't think about the money. I thought about the light, the feeling of standing inside the storm and keeping something alive for others. And for the first time in years, that was enough. I smiled. In the days after the school meeting, the air around me began to change. No one said much. There were no confrontations, no gossip, but something in the silence had shifted. Caroline's name quietly disappeared from the PTA list, the group emails, the winter fundraiser invitations. Some said she had stepped back to focus on family, but even in the way they said it, there was a small pause, the kind that carries caution. In Boulder, where she lived, neighbors started to keep their distance. The morning hellos faded. The small talk at the end of driveways grew shorter. I heard Peter, her husband, was under internal review at the bank for employee benefit abuse. It made a small column in the local paper, just large enough to be read, understood, and then left alone. No one brought it up again, but I knew Caroline was holding herself together, wearing composure like armor. That was her habit, to cover every crack with pride until the surface itself began to split. One evening while folding laundry, my phone rang. My mother's name glowed on the screen. I knew what she would say before I answered, but I still picked up. Her voice was tired, as if she'd just finished a long day without a kind word in it. "Can't you talk to your sister? Caroline's having a hard time. Everyone's turning their backs on her. She's still family. You could help." I leaned against the wall, staring out the window. The snow had stopped, leaving only thin rivulets sliding off the roof. "Family doesn't set fire to another's dreams, Mom," I said quietly. "Some things, if you let them burn, all you can do is learn how to live after the ashes." She went silent. I heard the faint stir of a spoon in a pot, the slow breath of an aging woman trying to make peace where there was none to be made. Then she said, soft as a whisper, "Families should hold on to each other, Grant. Blood is still blood." I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. I am holding on, Mom, by making sure no one in this family gets hurt again. She sighed. I heard the sound of a cup being set down, and then the line went dead. A few hours later, the phone rang again. My father's voice filled the line, steady, calm, like always. "You did the right thing, son," he said. "The right road is the one with fewer footprints. If you can keep walking it one day, you'll look back and see it was worth it." "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly. After he hung up, I sat there for a long while. Outside, the streetlight reflected off the thin film of ice on the window, scattering the glow into a dozen fractured stars. I didn't know if I was truly on the right road, but for the first time in years, I wasn't being pulled backward. Later that night, Sophie came out of her room carrying her sketchbook. She set it on the table and opened it. On the page was a drawing of a small house with light spilling from its windows. Outside, two figures stood together. I knew instantly it was us. She said, "Today our teacher told us to draw what makes us feel the safest." I looked at the drawing, then at her. I didn't speak right away. Then I reached out and brushed her hair gently. "You did great," I said. She nodded, eyes down, and then asked softly, "Dad, do you think they're sorry?" I sat still for a few seconds. A small draft slipped through the doorframe, rustling the paper between us. "I don't know," I said. "And I don't need to, as long as you remember your worth doesn't depend on their laughter." Sophie didn't reply. She just lifted her head, eyes clear and calm, and smiled, a real smile this time, the first since the night of the fire. The light of that smile touched me like something warm after a long storm. The room itself felt softer, the air gentler. Maybe that's how a father knows he's done something right. I closed the sketchbook, laid my hand on its cover. The faint dust of graphite clung to my fingertips. "You know," I said quietly, "sometimes what we need isn't an apology. It's to stop waiting for one." She nodded, then stood up and went back to her room. The door clicked shut. I stayed there looking at the drawing, feeling something spread in my chest, not joy exactly, but a peace I hadn't known in a long time. Later that night, I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cold but soft, the scent of melting snow mixed with damp wood. In the distance, the neighbor's porch light flickered faintly. I thought of Caroline alone now, maybe sitting in her dark kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound the counter lit by a single bulb. Maybe she was regretting. Maybe she was still convincing herself she'd done nothing wrong. Either way, it didn't matter. Everyone eventually faces the cost of the laughter they once used to hurt someone else. Inside, Sophie was asleep. I stood there a while longer, watching the stars fade behind a thin layer of cloud. The night wasn't as cold anymore, only still, like the quiet after a storm finally runs out of breath. When I went back in, I turned off the light. The last glow from the hallway reflected on the wall, falling across Sophie's drawing, still open on the table. I sat down, pressed my hand against the cool surface of the wood, and heard my father's voice again, slow and certain. "You did the right thing, son." The clock ticked in the dark, each sound like a small punctuation mark at the end of a chapter. January 2024 arrived with a deep cold that wrapped itself around Denver like a quiet warning. The kind of cold that turned every breath into thick smoke that made even sound move slower. I drove through streets buried in snow, the shop signs dim behind a white haze, the trees stripped bare and bracing themselves against the wind. Lena Carter's law office sat on the second floor of a small brick building, steady and unassuming. When I pushed open the glass door, a bell chimed softly, like the morning clearing its throat. Inside, it was warm. The scent of coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of paper and ink. Lena stood as I entered, her handshake, firm eyes, kind. She'd helped me draft my will 5 years earlier, back when Laura was still alive. We had just finished paying off the little house in Aurora then. I remember Laura smiling that day, saying, "At least now Sophie won't have to worry later." Back then, the future still had edges I could hold. Now Laura was gone, and the names that had once felt permanent no longer did. I sat down, unbuttoned my gloves, and looked out the window. Snow was falling steadily, blanketing the parked cars, softening every hard corner. Lena opened a file, her voice clear but gentle. "So what updates do you want to make?" I said. "Remove Caroline, Mo, and my parents." She paused for just a moment before lowering her eyes to the document again. "All assets to Sophie," I continued. "The house, the savings, the insurance, everything." She nodded, jotting notes carefully. When she finished, she looked up. "Do you want to include a reason for the change?" I smiled faintly. "No need. They'll understand." She didn't ask again. She printed the revised document, each page sliding neatly from the tray, pale and perfect. I read it line by line, dry legal phrasing stripped of sentiment, yet every word carried weight. When I signed my name, the ink sank deep into the paper, leaving a bold mark that didn't waver. "All set," Lena said softly. "Would you like me to send a digital copy?" "No," I said. "The paper will do." I folded the document, slipped it into its envelope, and buttoned my coat before stepping back outside. The wind met me with sharp teeth. The air smelled of new snow and iron. The street was quiet. Every old footprint had already been covered by fresh flakes. I looked up, the sky stretched open and gray snow falling slow and soundless, as if gravity had forgotten its work. I walked my hand in my coat pocket around the envelope. Each step pressed a small mark into the snow, clear but fleeting. I thought about all the years behind me, every time I'd tried to hold a family together, the faith that had burned away the silence that had somehow brought me here. The wind rose. Snow whirled around me, wild and beautiful. I pulled my collar higher and smiled. Justice, I thought, doesn't rush. It moves in small, deliberate steps, but it never loses its way. The crunch of my boots sounded like a heartbeat, steady, alive. I didn't feel cold anymore, just calm. Not the calm of victory, not even forgiveness, something quieter. The peace that comes when you finally put things where they belong. On the drive back, I passed the park near Sophie's school. Children were building snowmen, their laughter bright against the gray air. I stopped at a red light, watching the green reflection shimmer on the ice. A small bicycle leaned against the fence, just like the one I'd bought Sophie when she was 8. I could still see her falling, scraping her knee, then insisting she wanted to try again. Maybe her courage started there, from falling and standing up again. Maybe mine did too. When I got home, I hung up my coat and lit the fireplace. The wind still howled against the porch, but inside the air was warm and steady. I set the envelope on the table beside Sophie's drawing, the same little house, 2 figures standing together, light spilling from the window. I looked at it for a long time, then placed the envelope right beside it. Sophie came downstairs, hair messy, a mug of water in her hands. "Where'd you go, Dad?" she asked. "Just some errands," I said. She smiled and leaned against my shoulder. Her hair smelled faintly of soap and sleep. I ran my hand over it, saying nothing. I looked at her, thinking about the years ahead, the house, her future, all the things I'd one day leave behind. Not money, not property, something harder to pass down. The lesson I had learned too late, that kindness only matters when it can't be used against you, and that sometimes silence is another way of standing tall. I smiled. The firelight danced across the wall, flickering like breath. Outside, the wind still roared, but inside, the ticking clock had found its rhythm again, slow, steady, certain. And I knew, as the flames whispered and the snow kept falling, a new chapter had quietly begun. Spring came quietly, like someone opening a window before dawn. Morning in Aurora was soft and green. I set the kettle on the stove, listened to the steady click of heat, then poured the water into a pot. Sunlight slid across the wooden table and stopped on Sophie's sketch pad left behind from the night before. A few streaks of color had bled past the edges like little roads running out of the picture, continuing somehow into real life. Sophie brought her new laptop out to the porch. She sat down, hair tied back loosely, her face clean and bright. Her hand moved with calm precision across the trackpad. A new design appeared on the screen. The words came in slowly, letter by letter, as if climbing a ladder out of what had already passed. For those who stayed silent and still did the right thing. In the corner was a lavender-colored background, an image Sophie had taken with her phone that morning. Below it, a smaller line of text, almost like a note to both of us. "There is a quiet way of being brave." She turned to me and smiled a short, certain smile. "I want to print it," she said, "to hang in the school hallway." "Do it," I told her. She asked if I wanted to change any words. I shook my head, touched her wrist lightly, where the faint mark of an old burn had long since faded. "It's perfect," I said. For a while, neither of us spoke. The printer in the small home office began to hum, releasing warm, fresh pages one by one. I stood in the doorway and watched her align margins, adjust colors, check each small detail, as if every dot carried a pulse. She told me that Ms. Olivia had approved her submission and that next week the art club would hold a small student exhibit. "Are you nervous?" I asked. "A little," she said, "but the good kind." It had been a long time since I'd heard her use good and nervous in the same sentence. By noon, the light grew warmer. I refilled the pitcher, added a few slices of lemon, and set out 2 glasses. Sophie came out with the freshly printed poster. The paper was still warm, the ink scent sharp and alive. "The letters look like they wrote themselves," I said. My phone chimed with a new email. It was from Mark Riley. He sent the updated shift schedule with a short note. "Need someone steady for next week's night rotation. If you're free, take it." I replied that I'd manage. He added another line. "The team still talks about that storm night. They said you acted like a father should." That made me pause. Then I smiled. Later that afternoon, we drove to the school. The hallways smelled faintly of floor wax. Flyers for the spring festival lined the walls. Olivia greeted us at the door of the art room, calm, kind, composed. She looked at Sophie's poster for a long time, then nodded. "These words," she said, "remind me of the email a father once sent me with only 3 words in it, for awareness only." I told her sometimes saying less is how we keep strength in the right place. She smiled. "Maybe that's true." Sophie pinned her poster to the corkboard in the center of the room. Around it were the bright, playful works of other students. Hers had more white than color, and that white space drew the eye straight to the heart of the page. I stepped back, watching her smooth the corners, flat hands trembling just slightly, but holding firm. Maybe courage begins that way, with the act of keeping one small line straight. Outside, the air smelled of cut grass. Elm shadows stretched across the schoolyard. A few of Sophie's classmates ran over, complimenting her poster, asking her to help edit their photos. She laughed, took their USB drive, and sat down on the steps. I stood nearby, listening to their chatter. Something had shifted. Attention no longer clung to what had happened before. It had moved toward what she was doing now. And even when the past passed by like a shadow, it wasn't thick enough anymore to darken the ground beneath her feet. On the way home, Sophie asked to stop at the print shop on Havana Street to make a few smaller copies. I parked outside and waited. Through the window, I saw her talking with the shop owner, a woman with curly hair. They laughed. The woman handed her a small stack of posters, and Sophie stepped out, arms full, eyes bright as sunlight. And I realized some smiles don't need permission to return. They only need someone ready to open the door when they do. By late afternoon, she carried a chair onto the porch and opened her laptop again, making final edits for the online version. "Should I put the sentence at the top or the end?" she asked. "Follow your own rhythm," I said. She nodded, typed a few words, clicked post, then leaned back and closed her eyes. I draped a light blanket over her knees. On the screen, the words glowed clearly, for those who stayed silent and still did the right thing. Sophie rested her head on my shoulder and whispered thanks for the new laptop, for going with her to school, for not asking her to be strong before she was ready. I placed my hand over hers. It was warm, the kind of warmth that lingers after something has just come out of the fire. "Tomorrow," I said, "let's hang one of the posters here at home, right by your desk." She smiled and nodded without hesitation. I opened the window. The night air came in cool enough to keep us awake. I thought about the ones who had laughed, the ones who had turned away, and the few who had stayed. Then I thought about tomorrow, about my daughter walking through those halls, hanging her work, and stepping back into the light, fully herself again. If you've walked with me this far, if there was even one moment in this story that made your heart tighten, let it be seen. Like, share, subscribe, and help carry these quiet stories to others. Stories of those who chose silence yet still did the right thing. And if one day your child's gift is burned in front of everyone, ask yourself what you would do. Would you stay silent, or would you help the light come back on? I believe you'd choose the light.